Okay. So let's go ahead and get started with the lecture for today. Okay, so for the rest of the class, what we're going to be doing is essentially looking at taking a lot of the modeling applications and techniques that we've done and seeing how they're going to be applied to real world policies. I think most of the stuff that we're going to cover is going to be talking about policies in the US. And actually, a lot of it is actually going to be California-centric policies. And you know, that's kind of a function of both, you know, where we're located, but also the fact that the United States and California in particular have really strong sort of scientifically sort of rigorous regulatory entities. And so a lot of the sort of work that you see in, you know, scientific studies can end up making a big sort of impact in the way that policies are formed and designed, and even sort of instantiated. And so hopefully we'll see a lot of examples of techniques that we've done or models that we've talked about, and sort of how they have played a role in ultimately influencing some of the regulations that we see today. So the regulation that we're going to be talking about today is known as the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards. So this is near and dear to my heart. This is actually what a lot of my dissertation work was on when I was a PhD student. So I'm very familiar with this rule and regulation, and obviously there's a lot of sort of very interesting stuff that's happened over the last couple years in relation to this, which we'll talk about. And so today, what we'll cover is sort of a brief overview of how regulations get formed, particularly in the U.S., but a lot of other countries and states have similar sort of processes for putting these together. And then we're going to do a history of these standards. We'll talk about the modeling influences, and then we'll see sort of where we're at today with the regulation. Okay, so when we talk about laws, there are essentially two really broad categories of laws. So one is legislation versus regulation. And so legislation are the laws that you think of that are passed by, you know, the Congress in the US, or the state legislature at the sort of state level. And so these are rules that are essentially introduced by lawmakers, and then they go through a whole set of complicated procedures to sort of move through, you know, at the federal level, the House and the Senate. Oftentimes, you know, the bills go sort of back and forth. They have to reconciliate until both chambers agree. And it also has to go through a whole bunch of committees. So for example, if you are passing like a big transportation bill, you know, that first has to get approved by, you know, a transportation committee, a budget committee, and so on. And so at any sort of point in this process, you know, the law or the rule can be halted if it doesn't pass through. And then once it's passed by your legislature, then it's signed into law by the president unless he decides to veto it. And it's a similar process at the state level where the governor ultimately is the one who sort of signs off on the bill. And so that's how your traditional law comes into place through the legislature. But there's also rules that can be made by regulatory agencies. And so at the federal level, you might think of like the EPA, FDA, US DOT, Department of Energy. So these are all regulatory agencies that can create rules that have the same force of law that that the legislative rules do. And you may ask, okay, why do we have these sort of two different bodies that create laws? Well, I think what you'll see in a lot of the rules passed by regulation is that they are really specific in the knowledge that is required for regulating, that particular a particular problem. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect elected officials to have like this really deep knowledge about emissions or vehicles or the electricity grid, right? That you would really want rules being created by experts in the field. And so I think it's a pretty good kind of balance to have these agencies, both at the federal level and at the state level, to really address specific issues within like a sector or field. So the way that regulatory agencies create these rules is actually quite different from the legislature. So there's a lot more involvement from, or potential involvement from the public. So when a regulatory agency decides to create regulation, they first have to propose a rule making process. And that process basically entails the creation of a proposed rule that basically says, okay, here are the things that we want to include in the regulation. That goes out to comment from the public. And so, when the public comments on these things, you can get thousands and thousands of comments, which the regulatory agencies are actually legally required to, at least the EPA and DOE and DOT are legally required to respond to each and every comment. And that doesn't mean, they're going to write a whole report on every single comment that gets made, but, they have to at least say, oh, we've considered it and we decided not to implement, whatever changes that people want. But oftentimes, especially if the comments are good, they can lead to important changes in the rule. And then that regulation will incorporate comments from the public during the open commenting period. And then they will publish a final rule, which is the regulation sort of as it stands. And there are lots of points in which this can fail as well. You can actually, so Congress can actually come in and stop this if necessary. I don't actually know of any examples where this has happened. I'm sure there are, but I'm just not sort of directly familiar with any sort of energy or transportation related bills that or regulations that have failed due to this. Yeah, and so it gets published and becomes rule of law. So this class is really thinking about modeling, and what we want to think about is the role of modeling in policy analysis. And so we want to think about breaking down in the process that a law is made, where can modeling come into play and influence this process? Um, and so this has happened before, where okay, you have some analysis that provides an idea for a representative to draft a new bill, and that has uh, that has actually happened to me personally. We published sort of policy briefs based off of our research, and every now and then we'll get approached by staffers to particular state legislators who say, hey, okay, I think this is kind of a interesting idea, maybe we'll see if we can make this into a bill. And so even sort of prior to contributing to a direct regulatory or legislative process, you can actually influence the creation of a new rule if if the sort of stars align for whatever it is that you're doing. Another way that you can inject some of this sort of contribution is, after a particular bill is introduced, maybe the legislator will look for commenting to say, oh, does the design of what we're trying to do sort of make sense? And if there's modeling required to help improve whatever is being proposed, that's a time for that is a point in which your sort of modeling efforts can help influence these rules. So assessing impacts of policies. So this can be kind of like a post hoc analysis of, okay, if I introduce this particular policy, what's going to happen? Like, what happens to things like costs or emissions? And so this can play a role in any of these boxes here. This one is probably a little bit trickier. The timeline of trying to, to provide information for a bill can be really sort of brief compared to what you might expect for like a typical sort of multi-year research project, right? And so if you've got some big modeling effort, it can be difficult to say within 1 or 2 months, or even possibly a couple weeks, or in some cases even just a couple days, be able to produce modeling outputs that would look at the impact of like a really specific rule. And so unless you're kind of really well positioned and you're really able to model that a particular impact, and it's really only if your model is like kind of set up and ready to do this would you kind of have a direct opportunity to influence that rule as it's moving through the process. The vast majority of this sort of thing is more for so later on. So in this last box here, thinking about retrospective analysis to look at impacts of a policy after it's been passed, or to look at the effects of that policy sort of in the future once it's already happened, to see what sort of effect that particular bill had on whatever system you're looking at. Okay. So in the regulatory process. So the last slide was thinking about the legislative rulemaking process. So in the regulatory rulemaking process, it's a lot of the same sort of ways of contributing, except that you probably have a much more forgiving timeline in terms of being able to influence the rulemaking, particularly because the public commenting period tends to be a fairly longer amount of time. So you're talking about sort of on the order of a couple months typically for a public commenting period, in addition to the fact that, when a rulemaking is announced and the proposed rule comes out, that whole process usually takes a little while, and folks typically are not really blindsided by something like that. You'll hear about it coming, and so there's some sort of time to prepare. Yeah, and so I think for regulatory rulemaking, you typically have a much sort of better response to like quantitative modeling and analysis, oftentimes because these rules are built off of that type of work, as opposed to legislation, which can be sort of hit or miss. It'll depend on the legislator that you're working with and the stakeholders involved. That sort of modeling efforts could play a big or a small role in that procedure. Okay, so that's kind of like a high-level overview, sort of generalization about the rulemaking processes, and then we'll start to see some actual direct examples of injection of modeling analyses into these policies. So before we start talking about specifics, does anyone have any questions about sort of rulemaking in the US? Or actually, I'd be curious if anyone is familiar with the sort of rulemaking processes in other countries and wants to comment. I definitely have a lot less sort of expertise in that. All right. So the CAFE standards generally, so if you aren't familiar, and we're going to get into this right in a bit, it's meant to, it was a response to the oil crisis in the 1970s in the United States. And today we sort of think of it really as tied to thinking about emissions, and that's why it was coupled with the EPA equivalent rule, which we'll get into. But one of the other sort of large aspects is reducing dependence on foreign oil and thinking about that sort of reduction as sort of a national security aspect as well. So if you have sort of less reliance on foreign oil, then those reduced dependencies are sort of better for national security. And that's kind of what has led to a development by automakers to essentially promote more fuel efficient vehicles. Okay, so let's talk about how this policy really sort of came together. So CAFE, the corporate average fuel economy standards. So as I was just saying, the oil crisis in 1973, as a sort of direct result of that, Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, and this was meant to have a couple sort of direct goals. So increasing energy production and supply. And so, if we produce our own oil, then, we reduce the amount that we need to import. Reducing energy demand. So one way you can do that is essentially getting people to drive less. Provide energy efficiency. So this is closely related, right? So if the end use efficiency increases, then you're effectively also reducing your energy consumption. And it provided some more powers to respond to disruptions in energy supply. And this particular act basically required the United States Department of Transportation to enforce compliance with these standards. And so this is another sort of common element that I'll quickly comment on. So when we talk about the legislative legislative rules versus the regulatory rules, it is oftentimes you can see the legislature passing a particular policy that then requires the regulatory agency to create a rule to meet those policy goals. And so in order to implement something, you may actually see a policy move through both the legislative and regulatory rulemaking processes in order to create that policy. And so this is one example of that, where Congress responded to this particular need and created this policy, Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And then it was up to the regulatory agency to figure out how to design the requirements and how to enforce them. So this is a older slide about, or older figure about the history of CAFE standards. So this shows the sort of first instantiation back in 1978, when the standards were set for passenger vehicles, and then in the following year, so that's in the blue, and then in the following year in red were light duty trucks. So there's actually two separate standards. If you are a car, or if you're an automaker that produces a vehicle, a passenger car, you have to follow some set of requirements. And if you produce trucks, you have to follow a different set of requirements. In the red line is the actual standard requirements, or the solid line, sorry. And then the dashed lines are the actual average across the fleets. You'll notice that the mile per gallon is on the right y-axis, and they are not linear, right? So I believe we talked about this before with the MPG illusion, where you have a sort of 1/x effect. So the scale looks something like this. And then if you do in terms of emissions, which is not how CAFE is actually regulated, the numbers look something like this. And so the MPG requirements increase over time, and that corresponds to a decrease in emissions over time. And they are sort of directly linked. You can convert from a gallon of gasoline into grams of CO2 per mile. the EPA uses a particular number. It's 8,887 grams per gallon, so grams of CO2 per gallon of gasoline. Okay. And that's essentially how you convert between these two. And that's also irrespective of the efficiency of the vehicle, right? So in the combustion of the gasoline, you're going to get, you know, this in the combustion process, you get a fixed amount of CO2 per gallon of gasoline on average. And then the work that it performs in the vehicle is like a separate quantity, right? It depends on how efficient the engine is and how big and heavy the vehicle is, and so on and so forth. So these two numbers are sort of directly corresponding. Right. So CAFE, so one of the important things to remember is that CAFE is a requirement for automakers, not for individual cars. And so this is actually a common mistake that folks make, that all cars need to be like a certain fuel efficiency, but really it's the average sales weighted efficiency for each individual manufacturer to reach a particular target. Okay, so let me quiz you guys really quickly, and you can maybe just speak up or type in chat. Who can tell me what the average fuel economy for a manufacturer is that sells 10 20 mile per gallon cars and 10 30 mile per gallon cars? What's the average fuel efficiency here? Anyone?
I mean, I feel like the obvious answer is 25 miles per gallon, but I feel like that might not be right.
It is indeed a trick question. And okay, so this has to do with the fact that that the fuel efficiencies again are not linear in consumption, right? And so actually what you want is the harmonic average. And so it would be, so the actual average fuel efficiency would be 10, 20 MPG cars plus 10, 30 MPG cars is equal to 20 over X, where you solve for X, right? And that's going to be something, so X is going to be approximately 24 point something. It's not going to be exactly 25. Again, this is related to that same concept about the MPG illusion that we talked about in an earlier lecture. Yeah, so not super straightforward. And again, had we been operating in a world where we do gallons per mile or liters per kilometer, then this math would be a lot more straightforward. Okay. So when an automaker complies with the regulation, they generate credits based on the target efficiency. Those credits can actually be banked or even traded. And so it makes some of the it makes some of the calculations a little bit more complex, and it makes tracking it a little bit more complex because, you know, even if your out of compliance, or you're over complying, that can factor into decision making processes sort of down the line. So you can see, okay, so NHTSA, which is the sort of sub-organization of the US DOT, they enforce a civil penalty of $55 per 1 mile per gallon out of compliance per vehicle. So, say you have, let's say you have 100,000 vehicles that you sell, and you are 1 mile per gallon, under the required standard, then you would have to pay a civil penalty of, $55 times 100,000, so $5.5 million. To give you a sense of how big these fines are, you can see in this chart here, over a course of 30 years, these companies have paid on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. You'll note that like Mercedes and BMW and Porsche, so a lot of these are these luxury brand vehicles where, they don't really care as much because the sort of selling point of the vehicle are related to attributes not associated with fuel efficiency, right? Typically you're going to want more powerful engines, that sort of thing. And so this is kind of like a business cost to these automakers, where they'll say, okay, I'm okay with paying a couple $100 extra per vehicle, because I know that I'm selling it at a premium, and they'll sell better. They've sort of done that sort of calculus. And so really, sort of roughly speaking, and this may be a little bit less true today, but historically, European vehicles have tended to be the most out of compliance and tend to pay the most penalties. American manufacturers tend to be sort of right at the required standard. Some years they'll be slightly better, some years they'll be slightly worse. But they'll tend to be sort of relatively close to the standard. And then Asian automakers have tended to be sort of the most fuel efficient. And so automakers like Toyota and Hyundai, they have tended to over comply with the requirements, which means they get like banks of credits. Okay, so there have been a huge number of studies on the impact of CAFE. And so these touch into lots of different aspects of modeling techniques that we've talked about or covered in this course. Reducing emissions in oil consumption, so that's a fairly sort of popular one. There's a number of papers here. Equilibrium modeling, and so this gets a little bit deeper into economic theory. There's life cycle assessment, even sort of decision theory. And so all of this kind of falls under the category of modeling that looks at impacts sort of after the regulation has passed, all this sort of post hoc analysis. And it's important to do this kind of work to understand whether or not the initial goals of that regulation have been met. Are there any sort of unintended consequences? And sort of what are other sort of broader impacts that we have seen from this regulation that maybe was not anticipated in its original creation. So a lot of these studies are looking at that sort of post analysis impacts. But I do actually want to think about some of the more recent modeling efforts that have played a role in influencing the design process and sort of future regulatory proceedings. And so some of this does play a role in that, but we'll talk about some specific modeling studies. So in the 2000s, let me jump back here. So if you were paying close attention, one of the things that you'll see is that this line, right, it's decreasing here, it's decreasing here. But for a long period of time, this line was pretty flat. So for a period of about 20 years. So same with the truck, with the light duty trucks. And so because of that, California basically said, hey, we want to continue improving efficiencies, and and this is a lot more motivated by reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to broaden our discussion a little bit to understand the historical context behind this. So cars are made by automakers that sell to multiple states, right? And so one of the tricky things is that you may run into jurisdictional issues if you're an individual state that's requiring, specific regulations that may affect other states as well. That's usually when the federal government kind of steps in. But for the purposes of pollution and air quality, there's actually a pretty unique thing that had happened in the past. And so back in the 1970s, when the Clean Air Act was first passed by the federal government, California actually had their own Clean Air Act that preceded it. And it was actually more stringent than the federal rule. And so at the time that the Clean Air Act was made, they included a provision in section 177 of that Clean Air Act that basically said, okay, we're going to let California do its own thing. And in fact, any other states that would like to comply with California's rule instead of the federal rule are allowed to do so. And the states that ended up doing that are called the Section 177 states, because it corresponds to the section of the Clean Air Act that enabled that. And so I believe 14 other states joined in with California. And so this is a sort of pretty big precedent that happened in the 70s that basically allows California to make its own rules that affect the constituent states in that sort of agreement. But anytime that you make changes to your emissions policies, you are required to request a waiver. And that waiver allows California to essentially change their rules pertaining to emissions that affect other states. And so this senator, Fran Pavley, authored AB 1493 sort of as a response to the fact that the fuel efficiency standards were flat for a really long period of time. And they made a request for this waiver in 2005. And then for a long period of time, nothing sort of happened. And then it was denied in March of 2008. Okay, so this is sort of a little bit of historical context of things that were sort of brewing in California at the time in the 2000s. So note that, you know, this period was during Bush Jr.'s administration. Sort of happening concurrently with some of this stuff that was going on, Massachusetts and 11 other states actually sued the EPA to determine whether or not they had the authority to regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. So this is actually a pretty landmark case, especially in thinking about transportation emissions nationally. So the Clean Air Act is specifically meant to think about pollutants, and we think about pollutants in a traditional sort of engineering sense as local pollutants that affect air quality. But carbon dioxide is not a local pollutant, and it doesn't affect local air quality. It is a sort of broader scale, sort of quote unquote pollutant that affects, right, our climate system. And so EPA sort of never really had any regulation on CO2 prior to this. And so Massachusetts and these other states were basically saying, okay, we would like to determine whether or not EPA has the legal authority to regulate CO2 under something that we traditionally would not have said is a sort of policy that enables that. So they ended up winning, and not only that, not only did the Supreme Court rule that the EPA could regulate CO2, but they actually said they must regulate CO2, particularly from mobile sources. And so now you have a requirement for the EPA to create some standards for vehicles to reduce their emissions. Okay, so Obama gets elected in 2008, and they immediately sort of grant this waiver to California. And so the California Air Resources Board now, they have this Pavley rule, this AB 1493, which is saying, okay, we're going to now regulate the emissions for vehicles in California and in these 13 other states, which accounts for about a third, a little more than a third of the sort of total automobile market. So a pretty substantial amount of vehicles. And then at the same time, you've got the US Department of Transportation with the CAFE standards. They've got their own set of rules about efficiency for vehicles. And now you have the EPA being required to make rules about how much the vehicles can emit. And so these are all, so 3 different entities, 2 federal, 1 sort of state, multiple state effect. And you have essentially 3 regulatory agencies that could make regulation affecting essentially kind of the same thing. So this was all sort of happening in the 2008-2009 timeframe, and automakers essentially make huge pushback that if they had to follow 3 different standards, it would be much too difficult and much too costly. And so they agree to harmonize the standards. And so, you could have a separate standards for CO2 per mile and a separate standard for MPG. But what they decided to do was to sort of harmonize those standards so that your MPG and your CO2 requirements match up. Sort of. There are some details that are a lot more messy that we're not going to get into that make it a little bit trickier, because there's like off-cycle things, like things that improve efficiency or emissions that aren't related to the driving of the vehicle. So like things like air conditioning in the vehicle. So there are certain credits that could affect one part of the regulation and not the other. But we won't get into that. For the most part, we can assume that the standards are now sort of essentially binding, or not binding, are harmonized. And the really interesting thing about this whole process is that because California was at the table, they always had this sort of bombshell threat of like, hey, or they had a lot of leverage, because they could always say, hey, we think that your rules are not strict enough, so we're just going to still make our own. And because they were at the table, they had a sort of large influence on making the rulemaking a lot more stringent than it would have been had it just been sort of DOT and EPA. So they end up agreeing not to pursue their own regulation, but then sort of being able to push the other regulatory agencies to make the standard a lot more stringent than it would have been. Okay, so why don't we, before I get into the actual details about the standards and some of the modeling stuff that went behind the scenes, let's take a quick 5-minute break here. Okay, let's continue on. Okay, so in 2009, um, both the DOT and the EPA published this rule jointly. So the DOT rule is a continuation of the CAFE standards, and the EPA the EPA rule is called the greenhouse gas emission standards. And they are the sort of harmonized rules for efficiency and emissions. So this was passed in 2009 through that whole sort of rulemaking process that I was talking about before, where they proposed the rule, had a bunch of comments, and then published the final rule. The ultimate requirements for these standards were to so the average passenger car has to meet 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. And that is based off of a 2-cycle test, which is a way of how they measure efficiency. It's not particularly accurate. So if you were to translate this 54.5 to real world, it's probably more along the lines of about 37 miles per gallon. And so by 2025, there would be still a pretty large and significant improvement in fuel efficiency. That ended up getting modified down to 52 miles per gallon after the midterm review in like the 2014 to 2016 time period. NHTSA is not allowed to regulate over a period of 14 years. And so they split the regulation into 2 phases, 2012 to 2016 and 2017 to 2025. And so you pass this rule that goes out to 2025, but you allow room for feedback and changes to the rule in this sort of midterm review, and that will be a pretty sort of important aspect of this policy and politics in general in this area, as we'll see in a bit. One of the more confusing aspects of the new rule was this particular change to what is known as a footprint-based standard. Okay, and so first, let's talk about what a footprint is. So the footprint of a vehicle is essentially the area of its footprint, which is defined by the wheelbase versus the track length. So you can think of it essentially as the sort of rectangle that would cover the area under the wheels of the vehicle. So if you go from wheel to wheel and you draw that as opposed to sort of taking the sort of full silhouette of the vehicle. And there's actually a particular reason for this. I was actually trying to look for the paper. I couldn't find it, but there were some studies that were published that talked about the correlation between the footprint of a vehicle and its fuel efficiency. And so that was part of the impetus behind the regulatory agencies sort of doing this. So the idea is essentially this, the regulatory agency doesn't want to penalize a automaker for making like smaller cars or bigger cars. They just want to make sure that in general, everything is getting sort of more efficient. So let's take a look at a single curve. So if you look at the very sort of top line here, what this means is that below, a certain footprint and above a certain footprint, you have one particular standard. So vehicles that are larger than, say, 55 square feet, or have a footprint of 55 square feet, in 2012, they would have been required to have, this 26 mile per gallon requirement. And if you are under, say, 40 square feet, then you have something like a 36 mile per gallon requirement. And so you sort of average the footprint of all the vehicles that you sell in the fleet, and then that, wherever you end up along this curve, is your required harmonic average fuel efficiency. And then as time goes on, that curve will shift down, which means that the vehicle, so if you are, say, right here, if you're right at, say, 50 square feet for your average, every year those vehicles that you sell have to progressively get, cleaner / more fuel efficient. There is also a separation for light duty trucks. And what you see is a similar sort of decrease in light duty truck requirements. You'll also notice something sort of particularly interesting, where in certain years, it looks like they kind of overlap, like right over here. And also the sort of points in the cutoff for this kink is lower, as opposed in some years before sort of going up, as opposed to in passenger cars, where it's sort of all flat, or they're always sort of at the same point. And this was actually kind of a concession to American automakers, who tended to sell more light duty trucks. And by lowering this kink to a smaller footprint, that means that where this normally would have gone up, it's now flat. And so there's some kind of, I want to say, like, political favoritism here that is resulting in this sort of thing, that's basically allowing the big three automakers at the time to, it makes it a little easier for them to comply with the regulation. Okay, and so yeah, this particular system, it's a little bit confusing, and definitely a big departure from sort of how it was being done before. So this paper by Katie Whitefoot, who was a professor at Michigan, now at Carnegie Mellon University, was a pretty nice sort of retroactive look at one of the unintended consequences of shifting to a footprint-based standard. And so this was using this sort of forecasting model in an equilibrium context that considers, on the supply side, trade-offs between footprint and production costs, and on the demand side, they use this consumer discrete choice model to see how people would prefer, different vehicle sizes, fuel economy, and acceleration. And one of the sort of really interesting things about this is essentially, one of the ways that so the way that we expect automakers to comply with the regulation is just to improve fuel efficiency, right? That's what the policy is intended to do. But according to some of this work, they can make this trade-off where they say, okay, we will try and improve some of the fuel efficiency, but maybe we'll also try and make vehicles a little bit bigger. And in doing so, you don't have to improve the fuel efficiency of the vehicle as much because now your footprint is larger. And you can do this by, increasing the track length or the wheelbase. And you could still end up actually with the same vehicle size, because all you've done is sort of move the location of the wheels and the sort of in the design of the vehicle. Yeah, and I think since this was one of the earliest papers that has looked at this, but there have been other sort of retroactive analyses and modeling that have looked at this and have actually found that automakers do in fact increase the footprint to make it so that they don't have to raise the efficiency of the vehicle quite as much. And so you can actually go back and figure out, the impact of including this sort of design in the policy. What are the effects on reducing automaker costs and how much less emissions and fuel efficiency improvements do we see as a result of this kind of design decision. So another aspect of this particular policy is about setting the standard. So, okay, there's this question about, okay, we have this increasing requirement up to, on average, something like 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. Did they just pull these numbers out of a hat? Like, where did that come from? So actually, that's derived from a fairly sort of rigorous modeling procedure. And the way that they did this is they sat down with all of the automakers and they did this sort of expert elicitation, right? And so we've talked about what this sort of entails, and they essentially elicit technology costs and say, okay, in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, how much do you think it will cost to do this type of thing, to do like aluminum lightweighting, to include tire lubricants, to do direct fuel injection technologies and that sort of thing. So they look at all these possible different options of technologies, or a suite of different technologies and technology packages that could improve fuel efficiency. And they come up with this big list and they put it through this optimization routine. And this will interact with the current market and with the way that people decide they want to buy vehicles, and essentially arrive at, under a particular sort of cost constraint, what is sort of a reasonable level of efficiency that automakers can get to by certain years. And so that's kind of where a lot of the sort of numbers are derived from in CAFE. And of course that is going to depend a lot on your technology costs, right? And you could argue that, hey, if you're asking automakers about this, then maybe they could say that the technologies are going to be a lot more expensive than they actually are, and so it'll make life easier for them because the compliance will be not as stringent. So the agencies are careful about thinking about these things. They actually interview the automakers individually and in private, so that there isn't going to be any sort of potential collusion about this. But of course, you could still get things wrong, and so actually what what ended up happening was both in 2009 and sort of later on, a committee in the National Academies of Science was formed, and they essentially convened a committee of experts in the field to also study costs. And so this was happening sort of on a longer time scale than could have been done for the regulation, but nevertheless, it provided a lot of important information for the midterm review, to sort of double check, hey, all these numbers that that the automakers were saying, or other folks were saying at the time, how do they look? How do they actually look according to this committee and other experts in the field? And so it provided a lot of feedback. And one of the interesting things is, I think, but for the most part, a lot of the costs were fairly decent, but actually they ended up finding a lot of the sort of ranges of costs for some of these technologies was quite a bit lower, and so that's an important consideration in thinking about how easy or likely it would be for automakers to comply with those studies. And in the way in which a lot of these technology costs were derived, build off a lot of the techniques that we talked about. So they have sort of forecasting, they do a lot of financial analysis, they actually do some wedge analysis in there, different scenarios of adoption of specific technologies. They look at life cycle impacts. There's Monte Carlo simulations to think about effects and costs. And so, yeah, I think from a baseline of techniques that this course tries to cover, I think actually there's a pretty big overlap with the sorts of things that you can find in this particular study. One of the other sort of interesting things that some academics looked at. So this is actually a study that I did, that it was part of my dissertation, and this actually ended up getting cited in some of the newer rulemaking, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. But one of the things that we wanted to look at was whether or not those cost numbers, or how those cost numbers are impacted by interactions with other policies. And so, California has this requirement for automakers to produce some number of electric vehicles. When I was talking about this sort of model, hang on, back here, the way that you meet a particular requirement is you take the sort of least cost technology and you implement it, and you implement these technologies incrementally from lowest cost to highest cost to meet your fuel efficiency requirement. The thing about electric vehicles, though, is that they are really efficient, but from a cost efficiency perspective, they are quite high. So you're kind of jumping right to the end of the curve by forcing automakers to implement electric vehicles. So by doing that, you're actually increasing cost of compliance than was calculated through the regulatory rulemaking procedure. And so we replicated the Omega model, but then added in the ZEV mandate, and then you can see sort of what happens to your sort of reference cost scenario. So if this was just CAFE as they sort of expected it within this green, you'll see a sort of larger increase depending on some specifics about what you're assuming about the policies and about vehicle adoption. But generally, you're going to see the sort of average cost of compliance per vehicle increasing than what was expected. One other interesting aspect of the fuel economy standards is that emission rates, and so remember, we have now this two set of regulations, the CAFE standards and the greenhouse gas emission standards. They are technically harmonized, right, to be kind of the same, but that starts to fall apart when you're talking about alternative fuel vehicles, right? So federal regulation, right, they are harmonized between NHTSA and EPA. But let's take a look at an example of this vehicle. So you have efficiency and emissions rate, which are tied together. You have 55 miles per gallon, which corresponds to about 160 grams of CO2 per mile. And so these are the two things that you would measure for your standards. But let's look at the efficiency of an electric vehicle. So for a Tesla Model 3, you're going to get about 0.29. The efficiency is about 0.29 kilowatt hours per mile. And then the emissions depends on where you live, what time of the day you charge, and so on. And so they are no longer tied together, right? And so that's going to make regulation really tricky. And so how is this dealt with in the standards? The short answer is it's not really sort of accounted for. So the regulation includes some incentives for alternative fuel vehicles. They're called weights and multipliers. So weights are multiplicatively affecting emission rates for alternative fuel vehicles. So whatever your emissions rate is, let's say, it's 100 grams of CO2 per mile. So for an electric vehicle, the weighting factor is 0, which just means that we're going to count it as nothing. And so it doesn't matter what time of the day you're charging and where you're charging if everything gets multiplied by 0. And so it's kind of a shortcut for them, for the regulatory agencies to kind of not have to measure this. And then they also have multipliers, which makes it even more complicated. Basically, if I have a multiplier of 2, that means in the regulation, when I do the accounting, for every 1 electric car that I sell, it counts as 2 electric cars being sold for the purposes of meeting your requirements. And that is, arguably a simple way of dealing with this issue, where you don't have to figure out all these upstream emission. Oh, okay, I see a question, why are multipliers needed? So the multipliers are not exactly necessary. It's more of an incentive to automakers to produce alternative fuel vehicles. And so because you have this multiplier, essentially the argument is that you'll want to produce more of these types of vehicles because it makes it more beneficial in the accounting for your fuel efficiency. So one of the immediate issues with doing something like this is that where your CAFE standards are meant to improve efficiency, it does not do that for electric vehicles. So this is one of the most efficient electric vehicles on the road today. and this is one of the least fuel efficient electric vehicles on the road today. So the efficiency is 25 kilowatt hours per 100 miles versus 44 kilowatt hours per 100 miles. So that's like the equivalent difference between like a Ford Mustang and a Toyota Prius. So it consumes 76% more energy per mile. But according to the regulations, that efficiency difference is essentially the same. So there's not really any policy incentive or signal to improve efficiency in electric vehicles today. Okay, one other sort of modeling aspect. So this is actually another paper that I did during my sort of dissertation. Is this sort of complex effect of having these weights and multipliers. So, okay, the easiest way to think about this is, let's take a look at this black line. So this line represents the average standard requirement for automakers over time, right? And so I have some emissions rate and I have to lower that emissions rate over time. So say I am GM and I'm right on the standard. So if we were to sort of disregard all these weights and multipliers, let's say I sell one extra car, a Chevy Volt, and that the true emissions from the Chevy Volt looks like this blue line here. Okay. And because of this emission standard down here, actually, if I sell this Chevy Volt, I am now allowed to balance that by selling, a dirtier truck. And so if I average this red and this blue, I end up on this sort of black line. Okay, and so in reality, you really do essentially see this sort of thing happening where you tend to try and comply with standard and sell these dirtier vehicles because they tend to have higher profit margins. Those types of vehicles tend to be, larger, luxury vehicles, or like a truck, for example, that has a higher profit margin. And so as an automaker, I tend to want to sell those types of vehicles. And so I'm always going to be sort of binding to this standard, to this black line. Okay, but in the presence of weights and multipliers, what ends up happening is that even though the actual emissions look something like this, it's counting it in the regulation as this here, this dotted line, which means there's a balancing car vehicle that's actually up here that's allowed to be sold. And so that sort of dotted line. And so if I take the difference between the dotted line and the red and the solid red line, that's all like extra emissions that are happening because you have these weights and multipliers. And so this was this sort of large modeling effort where we could figure out essentially how much extra emissions or what decrease in the stringency of the standard would happen because you have these sort of weights and multipliers. And that actually gets compounded by the fact that you have other sort of policies that promote electric vehicles. And so in this work, we actually show that, I'm actually, if I have both the weights and multipliers and a ZEV mandate, you're actually going to be increasing the total amount of emissions from the interaction between these two policies, ranging from between 50 to 120 million tons of CO2 over the next sort of decade. Yeah, and so these are some of the some analyses that look at things that maybe the original modeling and regulatory efforts may have missed. And the goal of doing this is maybe to shed some light on some of these issues and maybe help to think about how you can improve the policy design in the future to avoid some of these sort of consequences. Yeah, and so hopefully all of this gives you guys a sort of small glimpse at some of the ways that a lot of the modeling and academic studies have come into play in helping in helping influence and design this particular policy. And we're going to do sort of a similar type of approach with a whole slew of other policies in the country and in California over the next couple weeks. Okay, and so where are we now with all of this? And so I should sort of comment that a lot of this stuff had been happening sort of in the 2009 to 2016 time period, where there was a lot of movements in doing this sort of thing in environmental regulation and potential for new pushes in sort of the policy makings world to help improve carbon mitigation in the transport sector and also in sort of other energy sectors such as electricity. And so I don't know, it was kind of an exciting time to do a lot of this work because a lot of the regulatory agencies were making a lot of these progressive policies to combat climate change. Okay, but obviously in 2016, some stuff happened. Namely, Donald Trump got elected president. And so in this particular policy making process, and then some of you guys may have seen this in the news, there were some pretty interesting developments. So remember that NHTSA is not allowed to develop rules for more than 4 years at a time. So all of that rulemaking from 2012 to 2025 was basically the structure of the rule as they saw it when it passed. But there is a requirement for the agency to undergo these midterm reviews and to modify the rules as they sort of saw fit. So again, you as a reminder, that rulemaking process looks something like, first you have to announce it, then you have to propose the rule, then you have to have a public commenting period, and that was historically for the Obama era CAFE standards was a period of I believe 9 months, and then you make an announcement of the final rule. So all of that has been slated to happen in 2017, the midterm review process. But what ends up happening is in November of 2016, Donald Trump gets elected president, and then basically at the beginning of December, right, the December before the change in presidency, the EPA announced the proposed rule in in sort of that last month. And they then said, okay, you guys have 1 week for public comments as opposed to the full 9 months, which sort of understandably caused a lot of angst amongst policymakers and stakeholders. And people were going crazy that week. It was, it was a hectic time. People were trying to get in comments to the rule. I mean, you're talking about like years of research that people have been getting ready to submit for midterm review to help improve the standards and all of that. And then 1 week later, they closed the commenting period, and then a couple days after that, and note that, right, this normally would take place over maybe the course of a year. So a couple days after they close the commenting period, they say, okay, we're going to release the final rule, and we've looked at all the comments and we've decided that it's good as is. Yeah, and so that all happened sort of at the end of 2016, right before Trump comes into power. So he ends up wanting to get rid of the CAFE regulation. And the former director of EPA, sort of at the beginning, Scott Pruitt, started making all these moves to essentially get rid of the regulation, but it's not that easy, right? There are a lot of institutional barriers. There's a lot of resistance from stakeholders, substantial resistance from, right, the environmental community and NGOs. Yeah, and so there is some sort of justification for a lot of this. Pushing through the midterm review was kind of a strategic move to kind of hinder this, but policies that get made in the transition period are easier to sort of undo. And so they made this argument that, okay, or a lot of automakers made this argument that, hey, we just want like the regular rulemaking process that's not sort of accelerated. So what ended up happening was the proposal of a new rule called SAFE, the Safer, Affordable, Fuel Efficient Rule, which is a modification of the CAFE standards, where essentially the bottom line is they essentially go out to 2021 and then they just freeze the standards to whatever requirement was in 2021. So there would no longer be any improvements in fuel efficiency after that year. The argument, the sort of basis for doing this is that there would be faster turnover, higher costs with the old rules, because the old rules required higher fuel efficiency. It would drive up costs and it would cause people to keep older cars, which they argue are less safe, hence the SAFE rule. In their analysis, they reduced a lot of the carbon pricing that we would see as benefits, and they also increased a lot of the technology costs that it would take to comply with the rules. Obviously, there was a lot of pushback. Actually, I'll go back and mention that one paper that I had written with looking at the policy interactions, that the agencies actually ended up citing that paper as one of the reasons why costs would be higher, but it was sort of completely misrepresenting a lot of the conclusions of our work, and so we ended up having to submit in the open commenting period a pushback against how they sort of characterized our work. But probably one of the more sort of famous pieces that came out of this, so this was published in Science, where a whole bunch of economists came together, famous economists in this field, to look at the actual costs that they were saying in the SAFE rule. And they were basically showing that a lot of the analyses were completely wrong. And this is just one example of modeling efforts to sort of dispute what was being pushed by the Trump EPA. Yeah, and so in the rulemaking process, you have to demonstrate through with a fair amount of scientific rigor, why you're making certain types of decisions. And so in the sort of open public commenting period, it's really important to get all of that in, or get a lot of that feedback in, because it all becomes a matter of public record. And so when this gets passed and inevitably moves to court, because a lot of stakeholders will end up sort of suing it, those, whatever gets sort of submitted in the open commenting period, ends up being sort of relevant evidence for the court case. And one of the funny things that happened in this time period, when during the open comment period for the SAFE rule, is that a bunch of former EPA administrators submitted the old rule as a comment for the new rule, so that all of the analysis that was done in the old rule would then be relevant evidence in the inevitable court case that would come out of it. So kind of lots of interesting sort of political strategies that come into this, and all of it is, the backbone of all of this is the modeling effort that goes into demonstrating the benefits and impacts of these standards. So just a little bit more so that we can get caught up to today. So you remember that there was this whole underlying thing about California being able to pass their own standards. And so California basically came out, the California Air Resources Board said, okay, if you guys pass this rule, then California is going to make our own rule. We're going to do an updated version of those Pavli requirements, because we want to be better than whatever the federal EPA is doing. And so that threat comes back. But one of the biggest issues is that, remember, anytime you change those regulations, you need to obtain a waiver from the EPA, and it was definitely not clear. So the waiver would not have been granted, and they were sort of pushing to go to court and undergo this legal battle to see whether or not it was legitimate for the EPA to deny the waiver. And so that whole process is probably really time intensive, which is not something that you want to sort of embark on with environmental implications from climate change, right? And so they did this, and this was actually a big surprise. It really kind of came out of nowhere. They sort of totally preempted that whole court battle by directly approaching automakers who voluntarily sort of agreed to whatever standards that California wanted to pass, which ended up just being sort of the old Obama rule. And so they said, okay, we're gonna just, forget the waiver, and we're just gonna, the automakers said, we're just gonna do it. And so those 5 automakers were Ford, Honda, BMW, Volkswagen, and Volvo. And then shortly afterwards, a couple other automakers sided with Trump in their in sort of the legal battles with California. So GM, Chrysler, and Toyota. And it was actually pretty funny. The day that they announced this, our governor basically said, okay, we're going to replace the entire fleet of vehicles in California with we're going to get rid of all the GM, Chrysler, and Toyota cars and replace them with these other 5 automakers. So a bit of like instant karma there. Yeah, and so this is sort of all happening prior to the SAFE rule coming out, and then the SAFE rule ended up getting passed last year. So on March 31st, the final rule was published, and it actually ended up being a little bit. It was also a little unexpected. The fuel efficiency improvements ended up getting decreased to 1.5% improvements per year. So the original rules were about 5% improvements in fuel efficiency per year. And we were expecting them just to be flat, but they ended up still actually sort of improving. And so you still will see some fuel efficiency improvements. And so that's kind of where we are today. But I would strongly suspect that there's going to be some new rules coming out under the new administration, and probably going to be extending past 2025 as well, that will undo a lot of what's seen or what Trump had done in his administration. Yeah, and so again, there was a lot of sort of political intrigue in this policymaking process, especially over the last couple of years. But remember that in this regulatory rulemaking procedure, similar to a lot of others, a lot of this is trying to be really science-driven and is derived from modeling techniques that we talk about in this class, and an application of those into this particular system. Okay, great. And so that'll be it for today. Just quick reminder that homeworks are due at the end of the day today. Other than that, I guess I will see everyone next Monday, and otherwise have a good rest of the week, and I'll stick around a couple minutes if everyone wants to chat, have questions or comments.